All right, so everybody should be able to get it. So I'd like to welcome everybody this evening. We're almost to the last speaker of the semester. We have one more coming up, and Marty, I think, has a speaker that all that information went out earlier today. So that's tomorrow. So if you're around, that'd be a great person for you to see also. But this the speaker tonight comes from many years ago. We did a program that we started where we would show local artists that were from MJC, Modesto Junior College, or from Merced College. And it's been really a great way for us as faculty members to connect with our peers that are teaching at those institutions. And we've had almost all the faculty now. I think we're to the point that we had everybody from Merced until they get to hire somebody new show with us. And I think we're just down to 2 people, if I'm not mistaken, that are full-time. And this is full-time people that's at MJC. So Paul Berger will hopefully be our person if that works out for him next year at MJC. So I'd like to introduce tonight Matthew Warner-Davies. And like a lot of us, he started in Northern California, migrated south, and like a lot of people in our area has migrated back up this way. I never thought I would leave LA, but after living up in the Northern California, I don't think I could ever live any place other than Northern California. There's just some really special things that we have. And I think the funnest thing for us being here is, we take for granted that we can be in nature within a half an hour of any place, right? If you go to LA, it might take you 3 hours to get to nature, right? Depending on the traffic. So, it's something we kind of take for granted. So with that, I'll introduce Matthew.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Dean, and all the gallery staff who helped me install, and Brad Petros for the catalog, and everyone else who I've worked with, and CSU Stanislaus. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to show my work and talk to you guys. So thank you very much. I'm going to just share my screen. I have a slideshow that I prepared of the works in the gallery and some installation shots. So let me just make sure I can do that here. All right. So the show is entitled Getting to Nowhere, and it's showing me over here. I'm going to try to do this so you guys don't have to see that. Okay. In 2008, I started this work, and it continued to progress over time. I started with some paintings, and then it worked its way into some ceramic sculpture and different types of plaster casting, and I did variations of it. These are the kind of early paintings I had, which are in the show. This work is more directly autobiographical than much of my work, and that was a new kind of feeling for me to involve myself in it a bit more. Sometimes I've had more like colder, more conceptual type of work in the past. And part of that came about because in 2018, I moved back to the region. I was living first in LA for a long while doing undergrad and graduate school. And then I moved up to the Bay Area and was working there at some colleges. And I had an opportunity to become a professor at Merced College. So I moved back, and I live actually up the mountain a bit out of Merced in Sonora because I have family up here. So I was up here, and all of a sudden these fires were happening, and I was like, wow, this is intense, because I had been painting my memories of landscape and places. And my first son had just been born, and the places I knew so well from my youth began to have these intense fires, the car fire, the Donnell fire, the camp fire. And I was feeling really traumatic, to be honest with you. And so I was painting these things from memory, and not actual, obviously, just not going out into the landscape and looking, but my reflections on them and kind of the story of the color and the effect of it and the sensibility. And there's this thing on here that I'll talk about later in some of the paintings. But part of it was I was feeling trapped in a corner with my previous work. My body of work had become, this is like a play on words, but also it become like so conceptually tight that I didn't know where to go with it. So I mixed up my medium. And also at that time, while I was watching the nightly news, I began to do these drawings of the fire spread, the edges of the fire, and these places that I knew so well that many people had never heard of before were all of a sudden on the national news. And I felt this impulse to map and follow it, like to see what was happening to my hometowns, to these places. And after the fires were done, I eventually revisited the actual places and was able to go back and see the charred landscape and walk through them and look at them. And that was pretty intense as well. But I'm going to tell you more about the show and the particular pieces as I walk through. I took the shots as if you were entering the door from the main gallery. This is the title wall. And then the name and the place, Getting to Nowhere, has a lot to do with, we live in these places sometimes, and I'm from a place that many people would be thinking to themselves, this is the middle of nowhere. Yet these places are full of memory and life. And in a sense, nowhere is a place. There is no place that is nowhere. So if you turn to the right as you go into the gallery, you'll see on the back wall a triptych and these two ceramic sculptures in front of it. And part of the nowhere idea came from this documentary that I had was really influential. It's Wendell Berry, and I had already known a lot about him from his poetry and his writings, and I really loved his poetry. It's called Look See. I had watched it, and it made me really think about my experience of landscape in a new way, and the idea of farming and growing up in places where land was used for these reasons. He's a huge advocate of farming and, cattle ranching and things like that. And I began to think about the countryside by coming back to it and also having this engagement with these ideas. So the sculpture to the left is broken, and it was broken in the kiln and the firing. And it was important for me to put forms like this into the show. They had little explosions and things went wrong with them. And I thought, okay, I'll just make more work. I'll get rid of them. But they had a sort of beauty to me, and also a sort of feeling of the actual process of firing. I've always been a conceptually process-based sculptor. And so for a reason of honesty, I felt it important to show the way I engaged with the material, and also the way these forms had gone through actual fire and had some kind of destruction. And it felt like it really reflected for me the sense of forest fires and losses in families and communities, and other ways of loss as well. And to the other side, you have this ceramic sculpture. The names of all these pieces are based off of lines from Wendell Berry poems. So they're sections of his poems. It's kind of an homage to him and his influence, but also the kind of thought of the poetic title, which can sometimes be overplayed, but I felt it was like a really appropriate thing for the way in which I was engaging with his ideas, and had always enjoyed and appreciated his poetry a lot. So I'm using the language of architectural models. And for me, there's an idea, even though they're not made out of the same material as usual architectural models, of a place of projection. So they're simplified because of my memories and the language of color and emotion, sort of like the paintings. But I want them to be like vessels. Buildings have an interesting relationship to vessels in a way, for other people who come in to have these reflections of place, and to think about their own experience of these markers in landscape, like a cartoon in the old sense of the word, not just like Charlie Brown, but a simplification as a way of projecting into it. This triptych on this wall here is pure landscape compared to the other ones have architectural elements in them. And this came towards the end of the show, preparing for the show. I realized that I needed and I wanted this idea of the beauty of the countryside, the placeness of it that the other paintings have behind them, to be the forefront, the focus of this. And there's this idea of a loss of contact that we feel with the natural world at times, especially felt this way a lot when I used to live in England in cities, and I lived in LA, and then I lived in the Bay Area, where there's kind of this feeling that we're kind of disconnected from it. And I used to long to walk out into it, try to find places of nature. And so it can often be, this hunger could be fulfilled by going out there, but we can't always get to it. And so there's this idea of a kind of nostalgia in a lot of this work. And this is where it gets more personal than other things I've done. Um, so this is to the other side of the gallery. If you've been in it before, there's the gallery desk, and then you go into the other side of the gallery. And it's an installation shot of part of the gallery with some of the sculptures here. And then I'll talk about these paintings as well. They became for me like specific symbols. And Flannery O'Connor, she's a Southern writer, Southern Gothic writer. She has a quote that really stuck out to me. If we want to understand ultimate concerns, we must see them through real, particular circumstances we experience in the world. And there was this thing for me of making, even though these are somewhat abstract, a specific actual object to begin to reflect on these things. And the forms evoke a memory of their use, the functionality of what they would be if they were actual size. And it's a reflection of thinking about my experience and connecting to these places. This is like a church type of form. And the use of churches and how the architectural developed over time, the old Basilica of St. Peter's, a Roman law court became old St. Peter's, and how they develop over time. That was like a different looking building, but these other buildings like this also have use, and it's associated with the way they're designed. And I like the idea of, with this one, it's related to the other yellow one that's behind it, and one's broken and one's whole. So there's a contrast happening with certain pieces, a repetition of some of the forms. So these sites of reflection for me are supposed to be for me to reflect, but also for the viewer to see them and reflect on the moments. This one has a crack in it you can't necessarily see, but it's about these ideas of permanence and loss, and the going through the actual fire, that showing the firing process was important. I had made some of these out of different type of materials, make them out of wood, plaster, a lot of different things before, but I ended up making some clay ones, and I was like, no, this is appropriate for the nature of the work, that they need to be fired things, even though I'm a sculptor mostly, but I haven't necessarily worked with clay for years and years. And I'm not like a potter really or anything, but I felt like this has to be this type of work that's gone through this. It matches the idea. And some of them are like home forms. They have these feelings of, for me, of family, very much tied to placemaking. We make home. We do some extent of it in our houses, in our places. And they represent, in certain ways, our family stories, our history, where we go out from, and then maybe we go back to. It's deep in the American psyche. A lot of times, if you play baseball, you make it around the 4 bags back to home. There's these ideas of sometimes a place that doesn't even exist anymore, like some of the places that went through these forest fires for me. And so there's that kind of there's a nostalgia about it. So this wall back here, I'm going to talk about some of these paintings, and you'll see that I drew a line on the wall, and then the paintings are all hung with the horizon line, matching with the line I drew, my hand. That was kind of for the idea for me to them being like almost snapshots that move if you drive past them, these places. So these works are named after actual streets. They remind me of the memory of them. I want them to show something of the world and something of art. It's kind of a twist on a quote by a famous filmmaker, Truffaut. I think I'm saying his name right. I also think I'm saying it wrong, but he did the 400 Blows and some other amazing movies, where he said he wants cinema to show himself something of, cinema, film, but also of the world. I feel like that about art. And so this line in them, this upside down L shape here, for me is a way of showing my relationship to accurate sight see measuring, looking and putting type of work, the proportional measuring that I do and teach at times. Showing it's also kind of a way of me showing you that these are not necessarily accidentally naive paintings, but a reflection on vision and sight and the way we remember and see things as people who witness things in the world that we go past quickly, or sometimes that we pay a lot of attention to. So I'm purposely, like I said, I was stuck in a corner feeling. So I purposely started to kind of break some of the rules for me of painting, or don't outline forms, make your light source more realistic, instead putting it from a particular point of view. And they end up being kind of like they're on a stage in some way. So this one in particular was a really reflective experience because it reminded me of my childhood home. It's about that Locust Street where I grew up, and it's a place I returned to around the time where I painted this. And it's kind of was a moment for me to recontextualize my story and reflect on my having a son, a new child, my first child, and then also remembering the place and it being so different as an adult, going back to it and it looking like way smaller and things not being as I had thought them to be. So this structure reminds me of going up the Skyway, and that's what it's named after here, which is it's the road that goes up to Paradise, where the really intense fire happened, where they were, probably seen pictures of it. And that's where I was born. So I was born in Paradise, and my grandparents lived there for quite a while too. We would go back and see them. Such an important place. And so remembering it how I had in my mind was an important with this sense of like a haunting beauty, a sort of loss of place to the car fire that won't ever be as it was. So some of them are also reflections of more current places where I drive through the gold country and live in, being present in my life, noticing what I notice, these kind of places that I want to pay attention to. And as the title of the Wendell Berry documentary says, look and see. So moments of my youth, remembering going past places and going down the Oakdale Waterford Highway, driving down and seeing these places. They may be nowhere to you. And when you look at these paintings, you see them as, aesthetic objects and the color design and some of the other things, but they weren't to me. And there's this kind of thought process of the somewhere of all these places we go by and our other people's lived experience in them. These are their important places. And then my lived experience. And then maybe these being an opportunity for you to think about what they remind you of in your lived experience. So a landmark. It's like this idea of if you were driving down the road and someone said, oh, the old barn on this street, turn there, and then we're the third driveway up, and that's how you get to our house. Well, there's this idea of them being these landmarks that we notice when they disappear, when we go through the places and we go through them again and again, but we don't necessarily think about them as important. So this is looking deeper into the gallery. There's some more ceramic sculpture and then some paintings here on the back wall and a couple more sculptures over here as well. Talk about this one. The title felt appropriate for home. This one reminds me of my current house and this idea, like I said, driving by places and other people's stories are happening there. And there's these stories we tell ourselves about our lives, and we have these moments of, connection and community and the context of them. But there's always more happening in them than we realize. And there's something about this with the engagement in the real world and an ever increasing, for me, like working with clay. It's such a disconnected. I felt it even more with COVID and having to teach online and all the meetings happening through this, even this one still happening this way, this disconnection feeling, became like really important for me to use my hands with clay to work and live on my land and where I live, appreciate it and use it to, in all the ways it could be used, grow food and things. And I'm not a Luddite. I'm fine with technology. It's not a saying that technology isn't good. It's more just I felt this kind of feeling about there's these things we take for granted. Once I thought about supply chains and lack of growing food, the storage of grain, like a grain barn, the making of hay, the things we don't always see happening and take for granted because of Fordism, the separation of skills and so many specialists in the current world. And there's kind of a idea of reclaiming craft, but there's a book called Craft that spells it Craft, Craeft, about old crafts. And I began kind of reading it and thinking about it as a way of how can we connect to these things. So these three I think of them as map paintings, are all named after the places I knew so well in the particular fires, not the actual fire itself. And this one is called Paradise. They're maps of the blaze. They're also abstractions, maps of abstractions, this idea of how do we think about this many thousands and hundred thousands of acres that were burned? It's like a giant number. It becomes this kind of abstract symbol, but also a number that's so big we're like, it's hard to contextualize. Well, it's giant in that sense, but also giant in the number of people it affected and the repercussions of people involved and, the losses as well. And so I felt this need to like somehow connect to this mapping process. I was watching it grow and then returning to it to return to map them. And these are like specific instances of loss, the fleeting nature of reality. But there's kind of this is Whiskeytown Lake, a place that I went back to and was so shocked to see because I have so many childhood memories of going there. But there's a sort of way that some of the old mystics might have said this idea of remembering your death daily as a way of valuing now the importance of life in these places, the importance of nowhere, the moments in between in places that aren't necessarily well known to everyone. And so for me, while I was mapping, I was thinking about these type of ideas. This one's up the 108, the Dardanelles are up from where I currently live in their beautiful area that were affected by the Donnell fire. And for me to do this, there was idea of memorializing, not forgetting what happened, because the next headline comes and I probably could never forget because of course they're connected to these places that are important to me, but kind of like making them as things that other people might not be able to easily forget it by looking at them and seeing these images. So over here to the side, there's just a couple more sculptures I'll talk about. And there's also this small stair casting. There's 3 of them throughout the show. And they don't necessarily fit in the forms as much as some of the other houses. And I think of them as they're copies of each other. They're made from a mold and they're cast, but they're different colors. The kind of form of a stair is the idea of going from one place to another. It is kind of a nowhere type of place in a building. It's just useful. And it made me think about the small scale is about the idea of projecting or our relationship to them compared to our own bodies, because they're even smaller than other things. Obviously, we couldn't use them and step on them, but there's this idea of when you see something that you usually use, it makes you think about that kind of relationship. That was the hope. And so they're all named after they're the forms you go from one place to another, and they're named after principles of logic, not principles, laws of logic, I should say. This one's a principle of identity. And for me, it was thinking and reflecting on my worldview and other people's worldview, how we travel through life and how we value our individual experiences, places, and our memories. So There's one there, there's one by the front window, and then you may have noticed this one by the wall when you enter with the title wall. Next around, just from the stairs, is another one of these barn forms. And it's a second one. It's a new color and a story, a color story for me, the emotional effect of color, but also maybe the way in which I'm thinking about it in design and the unity of it and working through the colors that work together. Seeing the same architectural style as some of the other ones, the repetition and commonality kind of began for me the dialogue of similarity and difference, the idea of things being specific yet also like other things. So this idea of the individual person, place, experiences, symbols, markers, but then its connection to the greater whole. So that's there. This is the last piece I'll talk about over here on this shelf on the wall, just around the corner from the entryway. It's the only other broken sculpture, and it's a broken house form. There's a part of the chimney here and the side walls. And there, for this one, when I opened the kiln, I had thought maybe it might have had a problem because I fired it a little quicker than I thought better to do, but I did it anyway. And when I opened it, I had this feeling of like a lot of loss and a bummed sense of loss. And it kind of became for me, like when I saw this, the context of the show, the painted buildings on the canvases, the paintings on canvas, these two broken ones are also painted with acrylic paint. They're not glazed. And there was, for me, this idea of a dialogue between the canvas painted acrylic forms and these two broken forms. Not maybe critiquing the idea of idealization or the surrealness of some of the other ones, but a specific loss in this, showing the marks of the fire and the firing being a specific marker of broken communities, families, and more memorialization, like I talked about before, but a real reckoning. For me, also the idea of a real reckoning that we could rebuild, rewrite, move on, and the symbols of the index of fire could be this eruption and disjointedness could be a context to how we could have hope that comes. So there's an idea in a song by Jacob Dylan that says something good this way comes, and there's this idea for me of something good this way comes even to nowhere. So places that end up feeling for many people like they don't matter and how they do actually matter. So thank you for listening to my talk.